The autumn of 1940 marked one of the darkest periods in modern history. France had fallen. The Low Countries were occupied. Nazi Germany controlled most of Western Europe, and Britain stood virtually alone against Hitler's war machine. Each night, German bombers pounded London and other British cities in what became known as the Blitz. The Royal Air Force had narrowly won the Battle of Britain, preventing a German invasion, but the victory came at an enormous cost. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister, understood that his nation faced not just a military crisis, but an economic catastrophe. The British Empire, which had once been the world's dominant economic power, was running out of money. The war effort consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. Every tank, every fighter plane, every bullet, every gallon of fuel had to be paid for, and Britain's coffers were rapidly emptying. The problem was simple and devastating. Britain needed American supplies to survive, but American law required cash payment. The Neutrality Acts, passed by Congress during the isolationist 1930s, explicitly prohibited the United States government from providing credit or loans to belligerent nations. These laws reflected America's desire to avoid being drawn into another European war, as many believed financial entanglements had pulled the United States into World War I. Britain had already sold or mortgaged nearly anything of value. Gold reserves that had taken centuries to accumulate were shipped across the Atlantic. British investments in American companies were liquidated at fire sale prices. The government sold art treasures, securities, and colonial assets. American negotiators drove hard bargains, knowing Britain had no alternatives. This fire sale of the British Empire's wealth was humiliating but necessary. By December 1940, the situation had become critical. Churchill sent Roosevelt a lengthy letter, one of the most important communications of the entire war. In carefully chosen words, Churchill explained that Britain would soon lack the financial means to pay for American goods. He wrote that the moment was approaching when Britain would no longer be able to place cash orders for American supplies. The implication was clear. Without American help on new terms, Britain might be forced to negotiate peace with Hitler. This letter landed on Franklin Roosevelt's desk at a crucial moment. Roosevelt had just won an unprecedented third term as president, campaigning on a promise to keep America out of war while supporting nations fighting aggression. He understood both the moral imperative of helping Britain and the strategic danger of allowing Nazi Germany to dominate Europe. But he also faced enormous political obstacles. American public opinion remained deeply divided. Isolationist sentiment was strong, particularly in the Midwest. The America First Committee, which included prominent figures like aviator Charles Lindbergh, argued passionately against any involvement in European affairs. Many Americans remembered the horrific casualties of World War I and wanted no part of another European conflict. Others questioned why American taxpayers should pay for British imperial defense. Roosevelt needed a solution that would provide massive aid to Britain while navigating these political shoals. The answer came during a Caribbean cruise in December 1940, where Roosevelt spent days thinking through the problem. He emerged with an idea that was both ingenious and deceptively simple. America would lend or lease military equipment and supplies to Britain rather than selling them. The concept Roosevelt used to sell this idea to the American public became famous. During a press conference, he compared the situation to a neighbor whose house was on fire. If your neighbor needed to borrow your garden hose to fight the fire, Roosevelt explained, you wouldn't haggle over the price or demand payment in advance. You'd lend the hose, help put out the fire, and get the hose back afterward. If the hose was damaged, the neighbor could replace it. The analogy was homespun and appealing, though it vastly simplified the massive transfer of wealth that Lend-Lease would represent. Roosevelt sent the Lend-Lease bill to Congress in January 1941. Its official title was An Act to Promote the Defense of the United States, a carefully chosen phrase emphasizing American security rather than British aid. The legislation proposed to authorize the President to transfer defense articles to any country whose defense he deemed vital to American security. The debate that followed was intense and revealing. Supporters argued that helping Britain was the best way to keep America out of war. If Britain fell, they reasoned, America would face a Nazi-dominated Europe alone, requiring massive military buildup and eventual confrontation. Better to support Britain's resistance now with supplies than to fight Germany later with American blood. Opponents saw the measure as a blank check for presidential warmongering. Senator Burton Wheeler called it the New Deal's AAA foreign policy, sarcastically comparing it to a domestic program that had plowed under crops, suggesting Lend-Lease would plow under every fourth American boy. The America First Committee mobilized opposition, arguing that the bill would inevitably drag America into war. The Roosevelt administration worked tirelessly to build support. Cabinet members testified before Congress. Polls showed growing public backing for aid to Britain, even among those who wanted to avoid war. The argument that prevailed was fundamentally strategic. American security depended on preventing Nazi control of Europe and the Atlantic. After 2 months of debate, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act on March 11, 1941. The vote was decisive, but not overwhelming. 60 to 31 in the Senate, 317 to 71 in the House. Roosevelt signed it immediately, calling it an act of faith that democracies must stand together. The law gave the president sweeping authority. He could authorize the production of any defense article for any country whose defense he deemed vital to American security. He could transfer, lease, or lend these articles on whatever terms he considered proper. Crucially, the law sidestepped the question of cash payment, stating only that recipient nations would provide consideration that the president found satisfactory. This deliberate vagueness was essential to the program's political viability. Roosevelt could tell isolationists that America would be repaid, while assuring Britain that repayment terms would be generous and flexible. The ambiguity allowed different audiences to hear different messages, a political necessity for controversial legislation. Within days of the Act's passage, the first Lend-Lease shipments were prepared. Britain would receive not charity, but partnership, not loans, but shared sacrifice. The program would eventually extend to the Soviet Union after Germany's invasion in June 1941, and to China, France, and other allies. The Lend-Lease Act fundamentally transformed America's role in World War II, even before Pearl Harbor brought direct American involvement. It ended any pretense of neutrality and committed American industrial might to the Allied cause. It represented an enormous financial gamble, a profound shift in foreign policy, and a recognition that America's fate was inseparably linked to the survival of democracy abroad. The crisis that prompted Lend-Lease was Britain's impending bankruptcy. The solution was American wealth, mobilized not as traditional loans, but as instruments of shared defense. This arrangement would reshape the war, the post-war world, and the very nature of international economic relations. The question of who would ultimately pay for this massive transfer of resources would take decades to answer fully, revealing that the true costs and benefits of Lend-Lease extended far beyond simple financial accounting. Once President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, the American government faced an unprecedented logistical and bureaucratic challenge: how to transform legislative authorization into actual ships, planes, tanks, and supplies flowing to Allied nations thousands of miles away. What emerged was the largest foreign aid program the world had ever seen, a massive mobilization of American industrial capacity that would fundamentally alter the course of World War II. The numbers themselves are staggering and difficult to comprehend even today. Between 1941 and the program's termination in September 1945, the United States provided over $50 billion in Lend-Lease aid. To understand this figure's magnitude, consider that it represented roughly 11% of America's total war expenditure and about 17% of the federal budget during those years. In today's dollars, adjusting for inflation, this would equal approximately $700 billion, though such conversions barely capture the true economic impact. The distribution of this aid reveals the strategic priorities of American wartime policy. Britain and its Commonwealth partners received the lion's share, approximately $31 billion, or roughly 60% of all Lend-Lease assistance. This reflected both Britain's role as America's primary ally and its position as the staging ground for the eventual invasion of Europe. The Soviet Union received the second largest allocation, about $11 billion, representing 22% of total aid. This support began after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 and proved crucial to the Red Army's ability to resist and eventually push back Nazi forces. China received about $1.6 billion to support its resistance against Japanese invasion. France, after its liberation, received over $3 billion. Smaller amounts went to other Allied nations, including Australia, New Zealand, and various Latin American countries. Even the Soviet Union's shipments included some aid that would ultimately reach partisan groups in occupied Europe, creating a complex web of material support that spanned the globe. But raw dollar figures tell only part of the story. The true scale of Lend-Lease becomes clear when examining what those dollars bought. The United States shipped over 400,000 jeeps and trucks to the Soviet Union alone, providing mobility that Soviet industry could never have matched. American factories produced more than 13,000 aircraft for Soviet forces, including fighters and bombers that proved vital in key battles. Britain received over 30,000 aircraft of various types, from fighters to heavy bombers to transport planes. The program covered nearly every conceivable military need. American shipyards produced destroyers, cargo vessels, and landing craft that went straight to Allied navies. Factories manufactured millions of tons of steel, copper, and aluminum for Allied industrial wars. Chemical plants produced explosives and propellants. American farms shipped millions of tons of food, from wheat and flour to canned meat and dried eggs, feeding not just Allied soldiers, but civilian populations in Britain and the Soviet Union. The diversity of Lend-Lease supplies demonstrates the program's comprehensive nature. American aid included not just finished weapons, but the raw materials and industrial equipment needed to produce them. The Soviet Union received entire factories, shipped in pieces and reassembled behind the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers. Britain received machine tools, petroleum products, and industrial chemicals essential to maintaining its own war production. Some of the most crucial aid came in forms that rarely appeared in headlines. The United States shipped millions of miles of telephone wire, allowing Allied armies to maintain communications. American manufacturers produced vast quantities of boots, uniforms, and other clothing items. Medical supplies, from bandages to sulfa drugs to complete field hospitals, saved countless lives. Railway equipment, including locomotives and rail cars, kept Soviet supply lines functioning despite devastating German attacks on the Soviet rail system. The mechanics of delivering this aid were as impressive as its scale. After Congress authorized Lend-Lease, Roosevelt established a complex bureaucratic structure to manage it. The Office of Lend-Lease Administration, headed by Roosevelt confidant Harry Hopkins, coordinated the entire effort. Hopkins worked closely with military leaders, industrial managers, and Allied representatives to prioritize needs and allocate scarce resources. The process began with requests from Allied nations. British and Soviet representatives submitted detailed lists of needed supplies. American officials evaluated these requests against production capacity, shipping availability, and strategic priorities. Often, this involved difficult choices. When British and Soviet requests both included aircraft, American planners had to decide which nation's need was more urgent, knowing that machines sent to one ally were unavailable to another. Production presented its own challenges. American industry in 1941 was only beginning to mobilize for war. Factories designed to produce automobiles had to be converted to build tanks and aircraft. This conversion took time and enormous investment. The government financed factory construction and expansion, created new production techniques, and recruited millions of workers, including unprecedented numbers of women who entered the industrial workforce. Getting supplies to Allied nations proved equally challenging. The Battle of the Atlantic raged throughout the war's early years, with German submarines hunting Allied shipping. Convoys of merchant ships, protected by naval escorts, braved torpedo attacks and winter storms to carry supplies across the Atlantic to Britain. The losses were significant, but never sufficient to stop the flow of aid. The northern route to the Soviet Union proved even more dangerous. Convoys sailed around Norway's North Cape to reach the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. German forces in Norway attacked these convoys with submarines, surface ships, and aircraft. Arctic weather added natural hazards to enemy action. Some convoys lost more than half their ships. The summer of 1942 saw the disastrous convoy PQ-17, where German attacks and ill-advised orders led to the loss of 24 of 35 merchant ships. Yet, the convoys continued. Alternative routes supplemented the dangerous northern passage. After British and Soviet forces secured Iran in 1941, the Persian corridor became a crucial supply route. American aid arrived at Iranian ports on the Persian Gulf, then traveled north by rail and truck through Iran to the Soviet Union. This route eventually carried more tonnage than the Arctic convoys, though it required building roads, railways, and ports virtually from scratch. The Alaska-Siberia air route provided another supply line. American pilots flew aircraft to Alaska, where Soviet pilots took over and flew them across Siberia to the front. This route proved particularly valuable for aircraft delivery, though weather and distance made it hazardous. The program's flexibility was one of its greatest strengths. When Britain's needs changed, allocations shifted accordingly. After the Soviet Union entered the war, planners rapidly redirected supplies to support the Eastern Front. When American forces entered combat after Pearl Harbor, Lend-Lease continued, but competed with direct American military needs for limited production capacity. Reverse Lend-Lease, though less publicized, was also significant. Allied nations provided goods and services to American forces stationed abroad. Britain supplied facilities, food, and services worth over $6 billion to American troops in the European theater. Australia and New Zealand supported American forces in the Pacific. This reciprocal aid reduced the program's net cost and demonstrated genuine partnership rather than one-way charity. The legal and financial mechanics were deliberately kept flexible. The original act specified that recipient nations would return surviving equipment or provide consideration acceptable to the president. This vague language allowed Roosevelt and later President Truman enormous discretion. Some equipment was consumed or destroyed in combat. Other items were formally transferred to Allied ownership for nominal sums. The final settlement would wait until after the war, when political and economic circumstances would be entirely different. Record-keeping for such a massive program presented enormous challenges. Millions of individual transactions had to be tracked: what was shipped, to whom, when, and at what official value. The Office of Lend-Lease Administration maintained extensive records, but the sheer volume and complexity of the program meant that precise accounting was often impossible. Some supplies went directly from factories to Allied representatives. Others passed through military channels. Still others moved through multiple intermediaries before reaching their final destinations. The program's impact on American industry and economy was profound. Lend-Lease production helped pull America fully out of the Great Depression, creating millions of jobs and generating enormous industrial growth. Factories that produced Lend-Lease goods expanded rapidly, developing new production techniques and training workers who would drive post-war prosperity. The program effectively subsidized American industrial modernization while serving foreign policy goals. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945 and Japan followed in August, Lend-Lease had provided the material foundation for Allied victory. Soviet forces that pushed into Berlin rode in American trucks, wearing American boots, supplied by American-built railways. British bombers that devastated German industry included thousands of American-made aircraft. The invasion of France depended on American-built landing craft. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Eastern Europe, Allied soldiers fought with weapons and supplies that bore the mark "Made in America." The scale and mechanics of Lend-Lease demonstrated American industrial might in the most tangible way possible. More than propaganda or diplomacy, the endless stream of ships, planes, tanks, and supplies proved that America could outproduce and outship the Axis powers. This demonstration of capacity was itself a strategic weapon, convincing both allies and enemies that American involvement meant inevitable victory. The question of who would ultimately pay for this massive transfer of wealth would prove complex and contentious, but the program's immediate purpose was clear: transform American production into Allied victory, whatever the eventual cost. The question of who paid for Lend-Lease appears deceptively simple at first glance. American taxpayers funded the program through regular taxation and war bonds. Congress appropriated the money. The Treasury disbursed the funds. American factories produced the goods. American workers received wages. The direct financial burden fell squarely on the United States. But this surface answer obscures a far more complex reality involving economics, politics, strategy, and the reshaping of the post-war world order. During the war itself, the payment mechanism was straightforward. Congress appropriated funds for Lend-Lease through regular legislative processes, and these appropriations were folded into overall wartime spending. American citizens funded the program through increased taxation and the purchase of war bonds. The top marginal income tax rate rose to 94% on the highest earners. New excise taxes hit everything from jewelry to furs to telephone calls. Millions of middle-class Americans paid income taxes for the first time in their lives. War bonds provided another crucial funding source. The government launched massive bond drives using Hollywood celebrities, patriotic appeals, and social pressure to encourage purchases. Workers could buy bonds through payroll deduction plans. Children collected pennies to buy stamps that could eventually be converted to bonds. These bonds were essentially loans from citizens to the government to be repaid with interest after the war. A significant portion of these borrowed funds financed Lend-Lease. The total cost of Lend-Lease, over $50 billion, represented about 11% of America's total wartime expenditure. For context, the entire war cost the United States approximately $350 billion. Lend-Lease was thus a substantial but not overwhelming portion of the total bill. Still, $50 billion 1940s dollars represented an enormous sum, equivalent to roughly the entire federal budget for several pre-war years. American taxpayers bore this burden with varying degrees of awareness and enthusiasm. Government propaganda emphasized that Lend-Lease kept American soldiers out of combat by enabling others to do the fighting. The garden hose analogy suggested that equipment would be returned or compensated. Many Americans believed they were making loans that would be repaid, not gifts that would be largely written off. The business community had mixed reactions. Some corporations profited handsomely from Lend-Lease contracts, though wartime price controls and excess profits taxes limited gains. Others resented government control over production and raw materials. Small businesses sometimes struggled as larger corporations received priority for scarce resources needed for Lend-Lease production. As the war drew to a close, attention turned to the settlement question. What would happen to all the equipment America had transferred to Allied nations? How much would recipient countries actually pay back? These questions proved far more complex and contentious than wartime rhetoric had suggested. The Lend-Lease Act itself provided little guidance. It stated that recipient nations would return surviving equipment or provide consideration that the president deemed satisfactory. This vague language had been politically necessary to pass the act, but it created enormous uncertainty about post-war settlements. Different officials and commentators held wildly different expectations about repayment. Some American officials expected substantial repayment, arguing that Lend-Lease had been a loan program, not a gift. They pointed to language in the act about return of equipment and payment of consideration. They noted that Allied nations had benefited enormously from American generosity and should bear some financial burden. This view was particularly common among fiscal conservatives and isolationists who had opposed Lend-Lease from the beginning. Others argued for minimal repayment, emphasizing Lend-Lease's purpose as mutual defense rather than commercial transaction. They noted that recipient nations had used American supplies to fight common enemies, providing benefits that far exceeded any financial value. They pointed out that equipment had been destroyed in combat or worn out through use, leaving little to return. This view was more common among internationalists and those who saw post-war cooperation as essential. The Truman administration, which took office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, faced the difficult task of negotiating actual settlements. The administration recognized that demanding full repayment would be both politically impossible and economically counterproductive. Most recipient nations emerged from the war economically devastated, unable to pay large debts. Demanding payment would foster resentment rather than gratitude, undermining American post-war objectives. Britain's case illustrated these tensions most clearly. As America's primary ally and largest Lend-Lease recipient, Britain had received $31 billion in aid. Britain emerged from the war victorious but virtually bankrupt, having liquidated foreign investments, accumulated massive debts, and exhausted its economy through 6 years of total war. The British people had endured bombing, rationing, and sacrifice on a scale Americans never experienced. Negotiations between Washington and London began in 1945 and proved difficult. British negotiators argued that Britain had stood alone against Hitler when America remained neutral, that British sacrifices had protected American security, and that Lend-Lease was mutual defense, not a loan. American negotiators countered that Lend-Lease had saved Britain from defeat and that some compensation was appropriate. The final agreement, signed in 1946, demonstrated American pragmatism and generosity. Britain agreed to pay $650 million for Lend-Lease goods still in British possession at war's end. This represented roughly 2% of the total aid Britain had received, essentially writing off 98% of the debt. Even this reduced amount was structured as a long-term, low-interest loan rather than immediate payment. The terms were extraordinarily favorable. Britain would pay 2% annual interest, far below market rates. Payments could be waived in years when Britain faced balance of payments difficulties. The loan would stretch over 50 years, pushing final payment far into the future. These generous terms reflected American recognition that demanding more would be both futile and counterproductive. Even so, the settlement generated controversy in both countries. Some Americans viewed it as Britain escaping its obligations. Some British saw it as America profiteering from British sacrifices. Winston Churchill, no longer Prime Minister, grumbled about the terms, though he understood the political realities that shaped them. The Soviet Union's settlement proved even more contentious and incomplete. Stalin's government had received $11 billion in Lend-Lease aid, crucial to Soviet survival and eventual victory over Germany. American negotiators hoped to use Lend-Lease settlement talks as leverage for broader post-war cooperation and Soviet moderation in Eastern Europe. These hopes proved futile. Soviet-American relations deteriorated rapidly after the war, as the Cold War emerged. Stalin showed no interest in meaningful Lend-Lease repayment, arguing that Soviet blood and sacrifice dwarfed any material contribution. The Soviet Union had suffered over 20 million deaths, devastation of vast territories, and destruction of much of its industrial base. From the Soviet perspective, Lend-Lease had been partial payment for Soviets shouldering the main burden of fighting Germany. Negotiations dragged on for years without resolution. The Soviets acknowledged a debt of approximately $2 billion for civilian goods received under Lend-Lease, ignoring military supplies entirely. They offered to pay a fraction of even this reduced figure. American negotiators, frustrated by Soviet intransigence on multiple fronts, were unwilling to accept such terms. The matter remained unresolved for decades. Not until 1972, during détente, did the Soviet Union agree to pay $722 million over 30 years. Even this agreement was never fully implemented. After the Soviet Union's collapse, Russia acknowledged the debt and made token payments, but the full amount was never paid. The practical reality is that the Soviet Union paid almost nothing for the massive aid it received. Other Allied nations reached various settlements. France paid back a portion. China's situation was complicated by civil war and communist victory, with neither the nationalist government in Taiwan nor the communist government in Beijing fully settling accounts. Smaller recipients generally made nominal payments or had debts forgiven. By any accounting, the United States wrote off the vast majority of Lend-Lease costs. Of $50 billion in aid, America ultimately collected only a few billion in payments. The program was not, in practice, a loan program at all. It was the largest grant of aid in history, a massive transfer of American wealth to Allied nations fighting common enemies. American taxpayers thus bore the direct financial cost, but the question of who benefited extends far beyond simple accounting. The United States received enormous intangible returns on its Lend-Lease investment, returns that shaped the post-war world and American position within it. Most obviously, Lend-Lease contributed substantially to Allied victory. Without American supplies, Britain might have been forced to negotiate peace. The Soviet Union might have collapsed under German assault. The war would certainly have lasted longer and cost more American lives once the United States entered combat. From this perspective, Lend-Lease was money well spent, purchasing victory at lower cost in American blood than direct combat alone would have required. Lend-Lease also established American economic and political leadership of the Western world. The program demonstrated American productive capacity and willingness to use national wealth for international purposes. It created dependencies and relationships that persisted after the war. British and other Allied leaders understood that post-war prosperity required American cooperation, making them more receptive to American leadership in creating post-war institutions like the United Nations, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund. The program helped shape the post-war economic order in ways favorable to American interests. During Lend-Lease negotiations, American officials insisted on provisions committing Britain to support post-war free trade and dismantling of imperial trade preferences. These provisions undermined British imperial economic structures and promoted the open, multilateral trading system that America favored and in which American corporations could compete effectively. Lend-Lease also strengthened American industry in ways that paid post-war dividends. The massive production for Lend-Lease drove industrial expansion, technological innovation, and worker training. American factories that built trucks, planes, and ships for Allied forces converted after the war to producing consumer goods, positioning American corporations to dominate post-war markets. The industrial base built partially through Lend-Lease production powered decades of American economic growth. Strategic benefits extended beyond economics. Lend-Lease created military relationships and interoperability that strengthened post-war alliances. American and British forces learned to use compatible equipment and coordinate operations. These relationships formed the foundation for NATO and enduring military partnerships. Even Soviet-American wartime cooperation, though it did not prevent the Cold War, established channels and precedents that occasionally proved useful. The program also served American soft power and ideological purposes. Lend-Lease demonstrated that democracies could cooperate effectively, countering fascist propaganda about democratic weakness and division. It showed that American capitalism could mobilize resources for collective purposes, challenging Soviet claims that only communist systems could match fascist industrial power. The program boosted American prestige and influence globally. Perhaps most fundamentally, Lend-Lease helped create the world order in which the United States has lived for 8 decades. The program contributed to the defeat of fascism and the creation of a world where democratic capitalism could flourish. The international system that emerged with American leadership, open markets, and collective security arrangements has served American interests remarkably well, producing unprecedented peace among major powers and extraordinary prosperity. From this broader perspective, asking who paid for Lend-Lease misses the more important question of who benefited. American taxpayers paid the direct costs, yes, but they also received benefits in security, prosperity, and global influence that far exceeded the financial outlay. Britain, the Soviet Union, and other recipients gained immediate survival and eventual victory. The entire world benefited from the defeat of fascism and the creation of a more stable post-war order. The final accounting of Lend-Lease cannot be reduced to dollars and cents. The program represented a moment when narrow national interest aligned with broader collective good, when American wealth was transformed into instruments of shared victory. The question of payment has a simple answer: American taxpayers paid. But the question of value has a more complex and satisfying answer. Everyone who lived in the freer, more prosperous, more stable world that emerged from World War II received dividends from that investment, dividends that continue to this day.